The man came in at 7 minutes the way he always had, and he set a single white rose on the counter without a word. He did not buy anything. He never had. Imani stood behind the register in her green canvas apron, her hands still cold from the walk-in cooler, and she watched him lay the rose down the way another man might lay down a key or a promise or the last thing he owned. He nodded once he turned to go, and taped to the stem where for 3 years there had only ever been the smooth green of the thorns trimmed clean, there was a folded envelope she had never seen before. She did not open it yet. She would tell you later that she could not, that her hands would not obey her, that something in the weight of the morning told her the envelope was not a card. The bell over the door rang once as he stepped out into the grey March street. By the time she crossed to the window, he was already gone, swallowed by the wet light and the bus that hissed past the corner, and the rose sat there alone on the counter, white as a thing that did not belong to her yet. She had no idea what she was holding. She had no idea that the quiet she had given that man for 3 years, the small uncharged grace of letting him come and go and grieve in her shop without ever asking him to pay for the privilege, was about to come back to her, larger than her whole life had ever been. She only knew that the rose was the 4th one of its kind, and that the other 3 were pressed flat in a Bible upstairs, and that her rent was 11 days late. Let me take you back, because to understand what was in that envelope, you have to understand the shop. And to understand the shop, you have to understand how Imani came to be standing in it on a cold morning with a rose she was afraid to touch. The shop was called Petals on Marlow, and it sat on the ground floor of a narrow brick building on a block that the city had mostly forgotten and the developers had recently remembered. It had belonged to her grandmother, Lottie's friend and rival both, a woman who had sold funeral wreaths and prom corsages out of that same window for 31 years. When her grandmother died, Imani was 26 and 3 months behind on her own apartment, and everyone she knew told her to sell the lease and the name and the cooler and walk away clean. She did not walk away. She moved a cot into the back room, and she learned the trade her grandmother had not lived long enough to finish teaching her, and she kept the doors open through 2 recessions, 1 flood, and a winter so lean she ate the bruised carnations meant for the compost because they were softer than going hungry felt. She was 34 now. She was a lean, tired woman who stood 5 feet 5 inches in flat shoes, with deep, warm brown skin and a soft, determined set to her mouth that her grandmother had worn before her. She wore her hair in a low, natural bun pinned at the nape, and she wore the same green apron every day, and she answered every phone call with the same line, the one her grandmother had answered with. "Petals on Marlow," she would say. "What can we grow for you?" She was a quiet woman, and the quiet was not weakness in her. It was the kind that holds a thing up. The block had 31 years of her grandmother in it and 8 years of her, and lately it had something else in it too, something newer and harder, in the shape of a man named Del Pruitt. Pruitt owned a development company that had spent the last 2 years buying up the buildings on Marlow, one by one, the way a tide takes a beach, never all at once, always a little more, each time he looked. He had bought the laundromat. He had bought the corner where the barber had been for 40 years. He had bought the 2 empty storefronts on the south side and boarded them with plywood, painted the grey of a held breath. He wanted the whole block, and the only stretch of it he did not yet own was the narrow brick building that held Imani's shop on the ground floor and 3 small apartments above it. He had come to see her in January, on a Tuesday, when the sleet was coming down sideways, and the buckets by the door held nothing but white roses and a few stubborn winter mums. He wore a charcoal overcoat and good leather gloves, and he did not take the gloves off, which she noticed, the way you notice a man who does not intend to stay long enough to shake your hand. He set a contract on her counter the same way the quiet man set down his rose, except that Pruitt smiled when he did it, and his smile did not reach the watchful narrow eyes above it. He looked around the shop once, slowly the way an appraiser looks at a thing, and his gaze touched the water-stained ceiling tile in the corner, and the cooler that hummed too loud, and the cot she thought she had hidden well enough in the back, and she watched him add it all up and arrive at a number that had nothing to do with what the shop was worth. He told her he was prepared to make her whole. He used that phrase, make her whole, as if she were a thing that had been broken. He offered to buy out the remainder of her lease for a sum that was more money than she had ever held. $40,000, he said, and he let the number sit in the air a moment so she could feel the weight of it, knowing as he said it that she was 11 days from a rent she could not cover. He told her kindly, the way a man is kind to a child he is about to disappoint, that the building was going to change hands regardless, and that the only choice left to her was whether she walked out with something or with nothing. He did not press. Men like Pruitt do not press. He let the cold and the leaking ceiling and the $40,000 do the pressing for him, and he turned the contract a few degrees so it faced her, and he set a good pen on top of it, and he waited. Imani told him the shop was not for sale. She told him she did not own the building, only the lease on the ground floor, and that he would have to take that up with whoever held the deed. And Pruitt smiled wider, because that was exactly the thread he had come to pull. He told her the deed was held by an estate, that the old owner was dead, that the building was tied up in a probate that had no heir stepping forward to claim it, and that a building with no living owner was a building the city would eventually let him buy out of back taxes. He told her this gently. He told her she had maybe a year, maybe less, and then he picked up his unsigned contract and his good gloves, and he left, and the bell over the door rang the same as it rang for everyone. And Imani stood in the cold of her own shop and felt the floor she was standing on turn to something borrowed. She did not know that January morning that the dead owner Pruitt spoke of so confidently was not dead at all. She did not know that the man who held the deed to the building that held her shop came into that shop every single week and set down a white rose and said nothing and left. Let me tell you about the Rose Man, because he is the heart of this. His name was Eli. She did not learn that for a long time. For the first year, he was only the 7 o'clock man, the one who came in on Thursday mornings 4 minutes past the hour, who took a single white rose from the bucket by the door and laid it on the counter and would not let her ring it up. The first time it happened, she chased him to the door with the flower held out, telling him he had forgotten to pay, and he had turned with such a stricken, gentle face that the words died in her mouth. He told her, in a voice worn soft as old denim, that he was not buying it. He was leaving it, and then he was gone before she could ask what that meant. He was a tall man, heavy in the shoulders the way men get who have carried things, somewhere past 60, with rich mahogany brown skin and close-cropped grey hair and a short grey beard kept neat. He had deep lines across his brow and slow, careful hands, and he wore a plain dark coat that had been good once and was only clean now. He did not look like a man with money. He looked like a man who had buried someone and not yet figured out how to live in the space where they had been. It took Imani most of that first year to understand. White roses, every Thursday, left and not bought, never explained. She learned it the way you learn most true things, sideways and by accident. One Thursday she was on a ladder restocking the high shelf when he came in, and she stayed quiet, and she watched him in the long mirror she kept angled by the cooler. She watched him set the rose down, and she watched him press 2 fingers to his lips and then to the counter, soft the way you touch a grave, and she heard him say a name under his breath that she could not catch, and she understood that the counter was a grave, or stood for one, and that Thursday was the day, and that the rose was not for her at all. It was for a woman who used to come to that shop, a woman the counter remembered. She got down off the ladder very quietly, and she let him go without a word. And after that, every Thursday, she made sure the white roses were the freshest in the shop. She moved them to the front, she trimmed the thorns clean so he would not catch his old hands on them. She never charged him, and she never spoke of it, and she never told a soul, because some kindnesses are loud, and some are simply a thing you arrange so. A grieving man does not have to ask. 3 years of Thursdays, 156 white roses. She never rang up. She would have told you, if you asked, that it cost her nothing. She would have been wrong, but she would have told you that. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that the woman the counter remembered was named Ruth, and that Ruth had been Eli's wife, and that Ruth and Eli had owned that narrow brick building for 40 years. They had bought it young, the two of them, when the block was a different block and they were a different kind of poor than the kind Imani knew, the hopeful kind. They had rented the ground floor to Imani's grandmother for a sum that never once rose in 31 years, because Ruth had loved the old woman and loved the flowers, and said a building that had a flower shop in it could never be a bad building. When Ruth got sick, Eli stopped coming around to collect anything. The grandmother had died. The granddaughter had taken over. Branda, and Eli, drowning in the long, slow water of losing his wife, had let the lease and the building and the whole world run on without him, paying the taxes by automatic draft from an account he never looked at, walking past the shop he owned every Thursday to leave a rose for the woman who had loved it. Never once telling the young florist behind the counter that the floor under her feet was his to give. He saw her, though. That was the thing. In 3 years of Thursdays, Eli saw everything. He saw her move the white roses to the front before he could ask. He saw her trim the thorns. He saw one bit of February, the eviction notice taped inside her own door before she took it down, and he saw the way she straightened her back when a customer came in so they would not know she had been crying. He saw her give a funeral spray at cost to a family from the 3rd floor who could not pay and write paid in full on the receipt anyway. Saw her keep a stool by the radiator for Lottie from the bakery next door, who was 80 and whose knees were gone, and he saw her walk Lottie home in the rain more than once with an umbrella she held entirely over the old woman's head, while her own shoulders soaked through. He saw her shop become the one warm, lit thing on a block going dark, the place where the neighborhood still gathered, where a teenager named Marisol swept floors after school for a few dollars and a safe place to be, where the locksmith Reggie from 2 doors down came in just to sit, and where people left their spare keys and their packages and their worries. Eli, who had stopped being able to see much of anything after Ruth, found that he could see Imani. And slowly across 3 years of Thursdays, the seeing turned into something that felt, against all the grief, like hope. He started keeping a folder. Imani did not know about the folder. He kept it in the spare room of the apartment he no longer cleaned, and in it he put things he asked his lawyer to gather, quietly, the way a careful man does anything that matters. He put in it the record of every property Del Pruitt had bought on Marlowe, because Eli still read the city filings out of an old landlord's habit, and he had watched the tide come up the block toward the one building he still owned and had not done a thing about it, because what did a building matter when Ruth was gone? He put in the folder a copy of the lease his wife had signed with the grandmother, the one whose rent never rose. He put in it a letter he wrote and rewrote a dozen times and never sent. And the day he finally understood that Pruitt meant to take the building out from under the girl by pretending its owner was dead, Eli put one more thing in the folder and he stopped grieving. Long enough to be angry, and an angry, grieving man with a deed in his name is a more dangerous thing than Del Pruitt had ever bothered to imagine. All of that was still hidden that cold March morning when Imani stood at the window and watched the bus take Eli away and turned back to the rose with the envelope taped to its stem. She made herself finish opening the shop first. She filled the buckets. She turned the sign. She let Marisol in the back and set her to stripping carnations, and only then, with the ordinary morning arranged around her like a fence, did she sit on the stool by the register and slide her thumb under the flap of the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, and a note in a slow, careful hand. The note said only this: Imani, Thursday is hard. You made it kind. I have something I should have given you a long time ago, and a thing I need you to do before a man takes it from us both. Come to the address below at noon. Bring the lease your grandmother signed. Bring nothing else. The rose is paid for. It always was. And it was signed for the first time in 3 years with a name. Eli. She read it 4 times. She turned the second page over and found it was a photocopy, blurred at the edges from an old machine of a property deed for a narrow brick building on Marlowe Street, and the name on the deed was not an estate, was not a dead man, was not the nothing Del Pruitt had promised her. The name on the deed was Eli, and below it, in the same 40-year-old ink, the name of a woman called Ruth. And Imani, who had given that man a rose's worth of dignity every Thursday for 3 years and counted it as nothing, understood all at once that the man she had been quietly protecting was the only thing that had been protecting her. She did not go to noon expecting what she found. The address was a low brick law office 8 blocks east, and Eli was already there, sitting very upright in a chair too small for his shoulders, and beside him sat a woman in a grey suit who turned out to be his lawyer, a sharp, kind woman named Marisol's aunt, as it happened, though Imani would not put that together until later. The block being smaller than the city pretended, there was coffee, no one drank. There was the folder, thick and worn, at in the centre of the table, like the rose set on the counter, an offering and a weight at once. Ali told her everything. Then, in his worn, soft voice, and it took a long time, because he stopped often, he told her about Ruth. He told her about the building and the rent that never rose, and the grandmother Ruth had loved. He told her he had owned the floor she stood on the whole time and had been too far inside his grief to say so, and that he was sorry, that a younger man would not have let her stand in the dark, wondering if she would lose everything when he held the light in his pocket the entire time. He told her the rose was never charity and never a courtship, that it was a man saying thank you in the only language his grief had left him, that on the hardest morning of his week she had made his wife's shop a place he could still bear to walk into, and that a person who does that for a stranger is a person you do not let a man like Pruitt grind into the pavement. And then he told her about Pruitt's filing, because Pruitt had not waited. While Eli grieved and Imani trimmed thorns, Pruitt had filed a petition with the city claiming the Marlowe building was abandoned, its owner deceased, its taxes soon to lapse, and he had asked the city to let him purchase it through a tax sale that would have wiped out Imani's lease and handed Pruitt the last brick on the block. He had a hearing scheduled, he had a lawyer of his own, and surveys and a folder of his own thick, with the patient cruelty of a man who took things slowly so no one could call it theft. He had even, Eli's lawyer had learned, sent a building inspector to Imani's shop twice that winter, looking for a code violation to paper his case with, which was why a man Imani did not know had stood in her cooler in January writing on a clipboard and frowning at her wiring. Pruitt had been mounting his case for a year. He had been careful, he had been thorough, he had simply made one mistake, and the mistake was assuming that the quiet old man who left flowers on Marlowe Street was nobody at all. The hearing was in 9 days. Eli wanted to sign the building over to Imani before the hearing. That was the thing in the envelope, the thing the deed photocopy promised. He meant to give her the building outright, the deed to the shop and the 3 apartments above it free and clear, so that when Pruitt stood up in front of the city to claim an abandoned building with a dead owner, the living owner of record would be a 34-year-old florist holding a deed in her own name with the back taxes paid current that very morning. Pruitt's whole case was built on the building belonging to no one. Eli meant to make it belong, beyond any argument, to the one person on the block who had earned it. Imani said no. She surprised everyone, including herself. She sat in that small office with the deed inches from her hand, the thing she needed, the thing that would save the shop and the apartments, and Lottie's stool by the radiator, and Marisol's after-school dollars, and the only home she had, and she pushed it back across the table. She told Eli she could not take his wife's building. She told him a gift that size was not a gift, it was a weight, and that if he handed it to her out of grief on a Thursday, he would wake up some other morning and feel that he had given away the last of Ruth, and she would not do that to him, not even to save herself. She did not raise her voice. She told him there had to be another way to beat Pruitt, a way that did not cost Eli the last thing his wife had touched. And the lawyer in the grey suit looked at this tired young woman turning down a $250,000 building to spare an old man's heart, and she set down her pen and she said, slowly, that there might be. Here is the thing Del Pruitt had not counted on. His entire case rested on the building being abandoned and its owner gone. A building, though, is not abandoned if it has a living owner who has been quietly maintaining it. And a man who pays the taxes by automatic draft for 40 years, who holds a lease his own wife signed, whose tenant has run a thriving shop on the ground floor for 8 unbroken years with 8 years of receipts and a block full of neighbours who could swear to it, is not a man whose building any honest hearing could call abandoned. Eli did not need to give the building away to defeat Pruitt. He only needed to stand up and be alive in public, with his deed in his hand, and prove that the building had never, for one day, been the orphan thing Pruitt had described. What he needed, the lawyer said, was the one thing grief had taken from him. He needed to be seen. He needed to walk into that hearing and let the whole neighborhood watch him be the owner he had stopped being able to be. And for that, he needed witnesses, the kind of witnesses Pruitt's money could not buy and his surveys could not answer, the kind that come only from a person having lived rightly on a street for a long time where people noticed. Imani had spent 3 years gathering exactly that kind of witness without knowing it. She went home, and she did the thing she was best at, which was tending what was in front of her. She did not organize a campaign. She did not make speeches. She simply told the truth to the people who came into her shop, the way she always had, and the truth moved the way water moves downhill. She told Lottie first. The next morning, when the old woman came in to thaw her knees by the radiator, Lottie listened with her hands folded over the head of her cane, and when Imani got to the part about the Rose Man and his name, the old woman's eyes filled and spilled over, and she said she had known a Ruth once, a Ruth who sold the building, a flower shop, and called it the building's good luck. And she asked if the kind man with the grey beard was that Ruth's Eli, and when Imani said yes, Lottie put her face in her hands and wept for a woman 30 years gone. Then she lifted her head and said in a voice gone hard and clear under the tears that she would be at any hearing they wanted her at, that she would tell anybody who asked exactly what kind of building it was, and that her knees could carry her that far if it killed them. She told Reggie, the locksmith who had kept a spare key to the building's front door for a decade because somebody responsible always had, and who could prove the building was lived in and looked after because he was half of why it was. Reggie did not say much. He was not a man who said much. He went back to his own shop 2 doors down and came back an hour later with a ledger, a battered spiral notebook in which he had written, in his cramped, careful hand, every time in 10 years he had been called to that building to fix a lock or let a tenant in or change a deadbolt after a scare. Dates and names going back further than Pruitt had owned a single brick on the street, and he set it on her counter and said only that a building nobody owned did not call a locksmith 200 times in 10 years, and she could use that however it helped. She told Marisol, who told her aunt, the lawyer who was already inside the thing. She told the family on the 3rd floor, whose funeral spray she had marked paid in full, and the mother of that family, a woman named Davita who worked nights cleaning offices and had never once asked Imani for a thing she did not pay back twice over, took both of Imani's hands in the cold of the shop and said that whatever a hearing was, her family would be at it in their good clothes, every last one of them, because there were not many people in this world who wrote paid in full on a thing that was not, and the ones who did got stood up for. One by one, the block that Pruitt had been buying out building by building remembered that it was not, in fact, for sale. The 9 days were not quiet. Pruitt heard, the way men like Pruitt always hear, that the owner of the last building had surfaced, and he did not fold. He fought. He sent his lawyer to argue that the deed was clouded, that a 40-year-old document with a dead woman's name on it proved nothing, that automatic tax payments were not the same as ownership and could be the work of an estate running on its own momentum. He filed a motion to have Eli's claim set aside as untimely. He offered Eli money, a great deal of it, a number meant to make a grieving old man's eyes go soft. And when that failed, he offered Imani money again, more this time, and let her understand, without quite saying it, that an old man's resolve was a fragile thing, and that she should think about who would care for her when Eli's grief swallowed him again. He was not a cartoon. He was worse than a cartoon. He was a reasonable man who had decided that other people's lives were inventory, and he defended that decision with every tool he had, all the way to the morning of the hearing. He simply could not win against the truth of how Imani had lived, because the truth had too many witnesses, and all of them showed up. The hearing was held in a municipal room with bad fluorescent light and folding chairs, and Del Pruitt arrived first in his charcoal overcoat with 2 associates and a cart of banker's boxes, expecting an empty room and a sleepy clerk. The room did not stay empty. Lottie came in on Reggie's arm and took a folding chair in the front. The family from the 3rd floor came, the children in their church clothes. Marisol came with her aunt. The man who ran the bodega on the corner came, and the woman who had bought her mother's funeral wreath from Imani 2 winters back came, and a dozen more came, who had simply heard that the flower shop was in trouble and that the kind man with the roses was real and was going to stand up, and they filled the folding chairs, and then they filled the back wall. And Pruitt watched the room fill and understood, perhaps for the first time, that he had measured the wrong thing. Eli stood when his name was called. He was slow getting up, his shoulders heavy, and Imani half rose to help him before she made herself sit back, because this was his to do. He walked to the front with the deed in his hand, the original, now 40 years old. Ruth's name beside his, in faded ink. He laid it on the clerk's table the way he had laid a rose on a counter 156 times, gently, like a thing that mattered more than himself. And he said in his worn, soft voice that the bedroom made everyone lean in to hear, that the building was not abandoned, that its owner was not dead, that he was standing right there, and that he had been walking past it every Thursday for 3 years because his wife's whole heart was in the flower shop on its ground floor, and he had not been able to bear to go inside and find her gone. He said he had let it run untended out of grief, and that the grief had been his failing, not the building's, and that any abandonment in the matter was a sorrow and not a fact of law. He said the woman who ran the shop had kept it alive when he could not, and that he would like the record to show that the building had been cared for every single day, just not by the man whose name was on the deed. Then the witnesses spoke, one by one, plain people saying plain true things. Reggie went first, because Reggie was nearest the aisle, and because a man with a ledger does not wait to be asked twice. He produced the spare key, holding it up so the bad light caught the worn brass of it, and he laid his battered notebook on the clerk's table beside Eli's deed, and he read out 3 of the dates in his cramped hand: a frozen pipe 2 winters back, a deadbolt change for the 3rd floor family after a scare. A lockout at 2 in the morning, he had answered in his slippers, and he said that a man does not keep 10 years of keys to a building that belongs to nobody, and he sat back down. Lottie went next, 80 and steady, on Reggie's arm, and she would not take the chair they offered her. She stood, both hands on her cane, and she told the room about a woman named Ruth who had once called a flower shop a building's good luck, and about an umbrella held entirely over an old woman's head in the rain while a young woman's shoulders soaked through, and about a stool by a radiator that had been waiting for her knees every cold morning for 8 years. She told them about a granddaughter who answered the telephone the same way her grandmother had for 31 years, the same 8 words, "What can we grow for you?" And she said that a street did not sound like that unless somebody was keeping it alive on purpose. Her voice did not shake. She had buried too many people to be afraid. Of a folding chair room and a man in a good coat. The family from the 3rd floor came up together, Devita in her good coat with her children beside her, and she said the words paid in full, out loud, and what they had meant the winter. She had no money and a wreath to buy, and she said it without shame, because Imani had handed it to her without shame. Then her youngest, a boy of maybe 7, in a clip-on tie, said in the clear, unguarded way children say, the thing the adults are afraid to, that Miss Imani was the reason they still had their apartment, and that she let him water the flowers sometimes, and that the white ones were for a lady who was in heaven, and the whole bad-lit room went very quiet, because a child had walked straight to the center of the thing while the lawyers were still circling it. Pruitt's lawyer rose to object that none of this spoke to the legal question of abandonment, and the hearing officer, a tired woman who had spent her career listening to men in good overcoats explain why the law entitled them to other people's homes, looked out at the full room and the old man and the deed and the boy in the clip-on tie, and said mildly that, on the contrary, it spoke to nothing else. It did not take long after that. A building with a living owner of record, taxes paid current, a 40-year tenancy, 8 years of receipts, and a room full of neighbours who could account for every brick of it being lived in and loved, was not an abandoned building, and Del Pruitt's petition to buy it through a tax sale collapsed under the plain weight of the truth. The hearing officer denied it. She did not lecture Pruitt. She did not need to. She simply found that the building was occupied, owned, and maintained, and that the petition failed on its facts, and she struck it from the calendar, and the matter was closed. Pruitt did not shout. Men like Pruitt rarely do. He gathered his banker's boxes and his associates and his good gloves, and on his way out he paused at the end of the row where Imani sat. And for a moment the watchful, narrow eyes looked at her without the smile, and what was in them was not hatred. It was the bewilderment of a man who had spent a year and a great deal of money on a careful plan, only to be undone by something he had never thought to put a price on, because it had never occurred to him that it had a price at all. He had walked past Imani's shop a dozen times and seen a failing flower store on a dying block. He had not seen what the block saw. He had not understood that the woman trimming thorns behind that counter every morning was the most well-defended person on Marlow Street, because she had spent 8 years building the only fortune that a man like him could not buy or condemn, which was the certain knowledge of a whole neighbourhood that she was theirs and they were hers. He left without a word, and the bell of the municipal door did not ring, and that was the last anyone on Marlow saw of Del Pruitt. Eli did give her the building, not that day, and not as a weapon, and not out of grief. He gave it to her 3 weeks later when the dust had settled, and the shop was safe, and her saying no had proven she would never take it for the wrong reason, which was exactly the proof that made it right to offer. He came in on a Thursday at 7:04, and he laid a white rose on the counter. And beside it he laid the deed, the real one, freshly drawn, with her name on it now, where the estate would have gone. Ruth's old building passing not to a stranger or a developer, or the void, but to the one person his wife would have chosen if she could have stood in the shop one more morning and seen who was keeping her flowers. Imani cried, then. She had not cried in the office, and she had not cried at the hearing, but she cried at the counter with the rose and the deed in front of her. Because it was Thursday, and the shop was hers, and the man who had been leaving his grief on her counter for 3 years was handing her the place where his wife's whole heart had lived, and asking her, by handing it over, to keep that heart beating. She asked him why. He told her the truest thing anyone had ever said to her. He told her that for 3 years she had paid for the rose without ever charging him a cent, that the price of it was a thing he could see her pay every single Thursday, the best white roses set out where his hand would find them, the thorns trimmed clean, the silence kept so a grieving man did not have to explain himself, and that a person who pays that price for a stranger has already bought the building a long time ago in a currency the deed was only catching up to. She kept the rent on the 3 apartments exactly where Ruth had set it, which is to say, low enough that the family on the 3rd floor wept again when they heard. She put a small brass plate by the door that said Ruth's name and the year she had owned the place, because Imani understood that a building remembers the people who loved it, and she did not intend to let it forget. She gave Marisol a real wage and the back room as a study spot. And the girl is in her 2nd year of community college now, mornings in class and afternoons among the flowers. Reggie still locks the front door at night, except now he locks his own neighbour's building and not an absent man's, and he says it feels different in his hand, heavier and lighter both. And Eli still comes, 7:04, every Thursday. He is not a tenant and not a landlord now, only an old man with a rose, and Imani would not have it any other way. He sets the white rose on the counter, and he presses 2 fingers to his lips, and then to the wood, soft, the way you touch a grave, and he says Ruth's name where the counter can hear it, and Imani moves the freshest flowers to the front the way she always has, and trims the thorns clean so his old hands will not catch, and rings up nothing, because some prices are not paid in money, and never were. If you have ever been the person quietly keeping something alive that no one else seemed to notice, holding a door open in the dark for a stranger you owed nothing, I think you already know how this feels from the inside, and I would be glad to know it found you. There are more like it where this came from. The shop is called Petals. On Marlow it still opens at 7. The white roses are still nearest the door, the freshest in the place, and on Thursdays there is always one fewer in the bucket than the books would say, and one more on the counter than anyone rang up, a single white rose laid down gently by a tall old man on the floor that a tired young woman saved without ever knowing it was hers. In the warm-lit shop that grief could not close and money could not buy, because a whole street had already decided, a long time before the deed caught up to them, that it belonged to her.